Hey, welcome to another roundup of articles from Hollie McKay's Substack. This is the edition for May 2024, and we're going to be looking at four articles that we have decided are the best ones to go cover and do a little bit more in depth with. How you doing, Holly?
I'm doing okay, thank you.
All right, very good. So let's just dive into it. The first one that I think we want to take a closer look at in terms of talking about is an article that you wrote early in the month of April on the situation in Darfur, having to do with it, in fact, being a genocide that isn't really receiving a lot of coverage in the world. Tell us a little more about that.
No, it isn't, and it's really horrific what is happening. A lot of us, when we hear of Darfur, which is a region of Sudan that sort of borders Chad in that area, is we think of the early 2000s when a genocide did happen there and the US did end up intervening, and it was sort of plastered all over the world and was something that everybody said never again. Well, here we are in 2024, and really this started last year. What we're seeing are really the signs of a genocide again, and of course it doesn't make the news, but what's happening is absolutely horrific. So while skirmishes have sort of sporadically flared since the early 2000s, since the first genocide, quote unquote, came to an end. It really picked up again last April. So you have the RSF, which are the Rapid Support Forces, and they're against the allied militias that are sort of more associated with the Sudanese armed forces. So you've got rebel groups, you've got arms that are militias that are backed by the government, and a lot of it really comes down to, in simplified terms, fights between Arabs and non-Arabs, and a lot of it does come down to land. And so a lot of the local tribes, including the Masalit, who are non-Arab tribes, and feel that they're, specifically being targeted by Arab groups that are doing whatever violence that they possibly can to get them off this land. And the level of violence is absolutely horrific. I mean, the amount of sexual violence is just mind blowing. You've got entire villages that are being burnt down, people being taken, um, just the worst things that humans can really do to one another. And I think when I look at Darfur, I see the just sort of the how is this possible in 2024, and really just the limits of the international community to be able to do anything to prevent this, even though this has happened again, even though of course we say never again, and here we are again. And so then it's just very disheartening in that really nothing can be done oftentimes, or things can be done and we choose not to do anything about it. And then it's easier just to turn a blind eye than even really to get any media coverage on it when there are many things in the world happening, but the level of violence and starvation, and that people are being even targeted when they go to these refugee camps over the border. So it's just a terribly vicious cycle.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so this was once one of the largest stories in the world during its first iteration. Today is what's really happening here that you got all these other conflicts in the world that are, for lack of a better term, more attractive to cover than one like this, that, that a conflict like this, or even the conflict in Myanmar, or any of these things that just aren't considered news interesting, are allowed to fester, and simply because, is it because the countries themselves have lost interest, or is it because the media has lost interest?
um I mean, the media follows stories, well, particularly in the US, it follows stories where they feel there's more at stake for the US. So that's why you'll often see a lot more coverage of Ukraine, especially in the early sort of phase of that war, because it was sort of a NATO, not a NATO country itself, but bordering NATO country. So therefore, the US had a big stake in whatever happened and whatever happens in that war. Similarly, in the Middle East, Israel has long been the US's sort of number one ally in that region, and we give a lot of money to Israel in foreign aid each year. And so there is a lot at stake in the Middle East. And then I think we look at places like Myanmar or Darfur that maybe there isn't as much at stake for the United States. It isn't directly sort of affecting national security the way that other places in the world do, or our interests. And that's the unfortunate part of the news cycle, is that sort of the attention goes where it's very US centric, so to speak. So it means that a lot of conflicts like what is happening in Darfur tend to no longer get the attention that they once got. And I think there's also a sense of people being jaded by the cycles of violence as well. So it's very complicated, and it's very unfortunate, because at the end of the day, these are human beings and oftentimes children, and they're the ones that are suffering.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, fortunately, yeah, I get some of my news from outlets like the BBC and Al Jazeera, and they do cover these areas. You just don't hear about it in
Mm.
U.S. coverage anymore, which is, I think, very,
Mhm.
very unfortunate. But kudos to you for continuing to follow them. Next subject, our next article. You wrote a piece about sweatshops, and while it's fashionable in places like the United States for where people are prone to taking privileged positions on subjects, and in particular the subject of sweatshops. You wrote an article that basically points out that in some cases sweatshops are the difference between being meaningful and unmeaningful, particularly for women in different parts of the world where these sweatshops exist. Go into that a little bit
Yeah, this
more.
is this is the problem of viewing things solely through a Western lens. Is that sometimes we've got to take a step back and put ourselves in the shoes of others and dig a little bit deeper and do our own research. Of course, in many instances, what we don't hear is that these factories, as abhorrent as they often are, they really do serve as lifelines for very vulnerable populations, particularly women who can often find themselves trapped in very abusive domestic situations. Of course, we have to acknowledge the very harsh realities of sweatshops, where you've got long, hideous hours, you've got extremely low pay and very low working conditions. But even despite some of these very painstaking environments, oftentimes this offers women a chance to escape the very oppressive confines of their home. As I said, domestic violence remains a big problem in many parts of the world. So for these women, the opportunity to work in a sweatshop can be a little bit of liberation. It provides a small amount of financial independence, and a chance to sort of break free from that cycle of abuse. And I think that's just one of the many things, if you read the article, that I will sort of highlight from the other side of the equation. So I think by pushing always just to have these shut down, we're forcing a lot of women back into obscurity and back into these cycles of abuse every day, where they can't contribute and they can't get away. So that is a very dangerous precedent to set. And I think instead of pushing for these sweatshops to be shut down, what we should be pushing for is better conditions, more money, and a little bit of reform, rather than trying to shutter them altogether.
Yeah, well, I uh, I've often asked the very nature of that question, which is the how much good does Western privilege thinking actually do in parts of the world where there is no privilege? And so I really like this article because it pointed out where even just any glimmer of hope for people who would otherwise be completely hopeless um, is seen as an up, where even though in the West it would be seen as something so far below tolerable that
Mm.
people would think of it as something that needs to be wiped out. And yeah, it really is perspective, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And that's just a case of digging a little deeper sometimes, and not always jumping on the activist bandwagon, because what you read about, sounds atrocious. And often it is, and I'm not denying that, but there is certainly more to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the internet is not a great place to find one's points of peer pressure to subscribe to. It usually leads you down the wrong path, and I think the sooner more people learn that, I think the better. Hey, you wrote another article which I thought was particularly interesting, which had a title of everybody loses in war, and then but the article itself is a catalog of who actually wins from the perpetuation of warfare. So, which I found particularly interesting in that you named everybody that I knew of, including the media in it. So
Mm.
like go over that article a little bit in terms of like, the catalog of why each element was selected as being, really
Yeah. Well, I've
benefited by
covered
continuing.
yeah, I've covered a lot of wars over the years, and I really, and and studying wars of that happened, prior to my time. It's hard to see how anybody wins in any conflict. Again, the headline says, except for these people, and there are people that win, but in generally speaking, I'll take sort of Ukraine, for example. I don't think Russia wins. I don't think the Russian people win. I think how many lives they've lost, how much blood, how much treasure, how much weaponry, how much sort of respect or semblance on the world stage they've lost. So the Russians don't win out of that, regardless of what happens. The Ukrainians certainly don't win, regardless of what happens. Again, they've also had to expend a lot of blood and treasure and put their lives on hold for several years now. So they're not getting anything out of their country being invaded. Um, the US, and other NATO countries that have to train and prepare and send a whole lot of money over there, we're not sort of, benefiting in terms of the everyday person. So they're overall, it's hard to see in war, that anybody's really winning. But again, when I say winning, there are people that financially benefit from it and that have an interest in perpetuating these wars, or at least perpetuating the fear of war, because that is the business model. And I think a lot of us know that. First of all, obviously, the arms industry. So war provides a very lucrative market for weapons manufacturers, because you've got governments or militias or whoever it may be that constantly need these to keep the war machines sort of churning. And I'm not anti the military industrial complex, so to speak, because I do think it serves a critical purpose, especially we look at the US, we have to stay, there are many threats, there are many people who would like to see the US brought down, and we certainly have to stay on top of that. But I think oftentimes there is a very sinister aspect to that too, where things as I said, can be perpetuated, can be dragged out, and can be even provoked, as a result of groups and lobbyists and other people kind of needing to make money. And then also with war, you've also got the natural resource exploitation. You just need to pick up your smartphone. And there's a really good chance that the cobalt that was used to make that came from the Congo, which is another very resource rich country, but absolutely hamstrung by war and bloodletting. And a lot of that is the different groups that want to come in and profit off those natural resources that we rely on for our everyday life. Wall Street in the financial sector, they also stand to oftentimes make good money with the onset and the steady state of war. So investors will always keep a very keen eye on the geopolitical events that are happening, and they will allocate their assets to capitalize on those market fluctuations, which are often triggered by conflict. And again, the defense industry, in particular, witnesses spikes in stock prices during times of tension and conflict. Also, speculating on war related events through arms manufacturers or other defense related stocks has become quite a niche and a very profitable strategy for a lot of investors. And that includes bankers, that also can kind of benefit from that in different ways. So you've got wars that sort of come with these significant costs. The nation states typically fund them not from their reserves, but by borrowing money through the US Treasury bonds. So banks, in turn, they benefit from the interest earned on those bonds. So primary dealers of US bonds, which are financial institutions, they also make profits through the sale. So the duration and expense of a war directly impacts the profits of the banks. And so when wars become perpetual, such as the 20-year war that we had in Afghanistan, that's sort of a continuous drum of financial gain. And then, of course, humanitarian aid sector that I guess stands to profit. And even though it is technically a nonprofit, it does make profit when these things happen, and more money to spend on its employees, more money to sort of spend on resources. So there's money there. And then, of course, the media, when a big event happens, the media also stands to gain money. And again, that's not to criticize because coverage is necessary, but they are a winner in war because it certainly drives up ratings.
Yeah, well, that's a long laundry list of people that benefit from people dying, and not necessarily a good laundry list.
Mm.
Of course, there's as you point out, there is if they weren't there, the degradation in the human condition might be worse because in the real world, you know, what do we got in terms of you got machetes um, in Africa, you've got bats and sticks on the border between India and China, and you've got water cannons in the South China Sea. You know, so people will find a way to bash each other, no matter what
Yeah,
happens. But the peace does seem elusive at times, doesn't it?
it does. It's very disheartening at times.
Yeah, it is. Okay, last item. You wrote a really interesting article about the shell game of Iranian uranium enrichment, which is, man, that's like, well, that's a tongue twister to pronounce, isn't it? Um,
Mhm.
but you know, and which is a fascinating game that Iran plays with its nuclear program, and uh, and worth sharing for people to hear more about because this is like what goes on behind the scenes in terms of inspections and violations and stuff like that. So
Mm.
do a little quick primer for the people that don't keep up with this stuff.
Yeah, so obviously Iran's nuclear ambitions, they've really long been a diplomatic and international concern, but recent revelations by the International Atomic Energy Agency, otherwise IAEA, that came out in February, that was their last report. They do quarterly reports. It really brought home to me just sort of this heightened alarm at the progress that the regime is actually making toward building its weapons arsenal. So essentially, at this point, Iran has completed all the work that it needs to create these nuclear weapons in very short order. And it just sort of comes down to how quickly they can compile it together. And that is still a little bit of an unknown. It could be a week, it could be 6 months. But having the sort of, I guess, the idea of having the world's very much leading state sponsor of terrorism and nuclear power, I think that's a major security threat for the US, and for a lot of our allies and players all across the world. So the IAEA's most recent quarterly report, it says that Iran has significantly increased its total enriched uranium stockpile, from around 2,289 pounds, that was in November, and now you're looking at more than 12,000 pounds. And it's also just enriched the uranium to 60% purity, which is actually a decline, but that's very easily lifted by the Iranians. And that a little bit complicated, but it points to the ploy that Iran, I guess, does with these reports, where it will, increase its stockpile, but then it might decrease another part, such as the enriched uranium, knowing that it can increase it again very quickly. But by decreasing it, what they're trying to do is say, "Hey, we're not doing anything." But it's just sort of it's a very thinly veiled ploy that I think most analysts and observers certainly can see through. So that is something that is certainly a reality that's becoming a lot closer, and something that the US is, whoever is our next president, whether it's Biden or whether it's Trump, it's something they're going to have to deal with. And I think either of those two picks are going to deal with this in a very different way. But certainly as it stands, there's going to be no new renewal of the JCPOA, otherwise the Obama nuclear deal from 2015. I think that opportunity is very much sailed. So now it's sort of a matter of figuring out, A, can Iran be contained? Or B, if it can't, how we're going to counter that and what the US government can do about that.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I really find most interesting about the what Iran is doing from a technical and tactical standpoint is that they have clearly perfected the technology to create weapons grade uranium. And they're playing a game by enriching and then diluting their uranium stocks, which
Mm.
is really, it tests their systems to see how quickly, how fast, how efficiently, what's the quality of the engineering, and they're learning as they're going along. So the most interesting thing I found about your article is the estimate that if they really wanted to push, they could have the weapons grade uranium ready inside, between 7 days and a month in order to complete the construction of a bomb. They probably already have the remainder of the components of these weapons already sitting there ready to go. And so from their posture vis-a-vis the rest of the Middle East,
Mm.
um, they're not that far away from being able to say, like we could be a nuclear power in 7 days, which is a very interesting position to take. And it causes a lot of tripwires to go off. In particular, the tripwire that you worry about most, of course, is the tripwire of the Israelis reacting to that. Now,
Absolutely. To be a nuclear power comes with a huge amount of responsibility, and I think it is it's a big cause for concern, I think, in many aspects. Yeah.
yeah, it is. I mean, and I gotta, like I'm an analyst, right? So like I look at this stuff from both sides. I do have to hand it to Iran that they are very carefully walking a line of what they can get away with. That's a sign of a government that understands where it sits with regards to its nuclear posture in the region, and definitely not something to be taken lightly by the West. Do you agree?
Definitely not. Absolutely. And just sort of closing note, slightly off topic, but a lot of us remember, I think it was about 3 weeks ago now, that Iran tried to track Israel with 300 plus drones from, it was the first time that they really done that from their own territory. And of course, I think Israel was able to shoot them all down or bring them all down with their iron domes, barring maybe one. But and there was a lot of talk about obviously Israel's superiority in that way, and because nobody was harmed, it wasn't the big story that it could have been. But I think what also the media failed to kind of acknowledge was what Iran actually still gained from that, even though they didn't have the perhaps desired effect of overburdening the systems or any casualties. But they were in being able to do that, they're able to pinpoint exactly how Israel's weapon systems works, where it's located, how it's pointed. So Israel gains a lot of, Iran gains a lot of intelligence out of that, even though it wasn't quote unquote successful on the surface. So again, this is where we have to put ourselves in the shoes of others and see things from a different perspective, because I think that Iran gained a lot from that attack.
Yeah, I agree. This is definitely the closest analog is testing your systems against your enemy. Um, they clearly did not send enough to expect a lot, but they sent enough to learn a lot, and
Yeah.
that is
And
something
now
that I
they've got
think people in the West have.
a
Yeah.
better idea of how much they need to send next time. If it's not
Hmm.
300, then what is it? What is it going to take? And that's something I'm sure they're configuring.
Yes, of course. And then the Israelis, of course, are now worrying about what if they send enough to overwhelm us now that they've got some data. Um, uh, One last question about that, because I'm very, very curious. Typically, also, when Iran does something like this, there's also usually a domestic reason for posturing an attack. Did you, in any of your feelers around the world, sense that there was a need for the domestic profile of the Iranian government to have the
Of
need to
course,
show
I
this
absolutely, I
game.
think that's a given. Anytime that a country feels that it's been targeted, which in this case, Israel had killed Iranian officials in Syria, you have to. It would come as no surprise that there has to be an act of retaliation of some degree, and that's to show strength that you can't be walked over. I think any country is going to do that. The United States certainly does it all the time. Israel's going to do it. Iran does it. Any country, when they've been attacked, is going to show some sort of retaliation, and they have to do that to show that they're not weak, and that's how governments run, for better or worse.
Yeah, well, that kind of adds a little extra twist to that previous article we talked about as to, who actually benefits from these kinds of conflicts occurring. Well, Holly, it's certainly been an interesting conversation. And as always, yeah, the information that you bring to people that have an interest in foreign policy affairs and things around the world having to do with the humanitarian condition that people just tend not to cover is always much appreciated. So until next time. Oh, is there anything that you're doing that you'd like the world to know about? Podcasts, things like that that might be coming up that were I
Oh,
know
just follow
you've
my
got this book
Instagram.
coming. You've
Yeah.
got this book
Yeah,
coming
books
out.
coming. We do. We have The Dictator's Wife. So please follow my Instagram at Hollie S. McKay, and I'll post all my updates there. So but yes, anyone interested in my books, holly.mckay.com or holliemckay.com/books, and that's where you can find the links to get them all. And please subscribe to my Substack and comment and send me notes, and I appreciate feedback. So thank you for your support.
There you go. All right, Hollie McKay. Another month of interesting things around the world. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again soon. And I hear
Thanks,
little Raven
Dennis.
in the background. So cute.
Yeah, she's playing.
All right, very good. Okay, we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.